It began quietly. No alarms, no warning, just a light. Too white, too clean, spreading across the horizon like dawn trying to outrun something darker. For a few brief seconds, the world held its breath. Then came the hum, low, endless, like the earth remembering its heartbeat for the first time in centuries. It was beautiful in a way, until the birds stopped flying. People looked up, blinking at the sky, their phones half raised, their coffee cups cooling in their hands. No one screamed. Not yet. They were still trying to understand what silence that big could mean. They said later the first cracks appeared under the Pacific. But on that morning it began here, in the heart of the mountains where the air was thin and the world still whispered to itself. If you're hearing this, take a moment. Like the story, subscribe to it. Because once we begin, there's no going back. This isn't about how the world ended. It's about how one boy tried to find the last place it was still alive. Before the sky turned to stone. Before the oceans boiled. Before maps became lies. He was just a student. Name, Ethan Cole, 20 years old. Dreamer. Photographer. The kind of kid who stopped mid-walk to take a picture of dust swirling in sunlight. He didn't believe in miracles. Not yet. Back then the world still breathed. The air smelled like pine and rain. Mornings carried color, gold bleeding into the peaks, fog curling over ridges like smoke from a sleeping giant. He lived with his grandmother in a cabin that clung to the edge of a Colorado valley. One of those old wooden places that groaned when the wind changed. She used to tell him stories. "Do you know why the mountains hum, Ethan?" she'd ask. "They don't hum, Grandma." "They do. You just haven't learned to listen yet." He would laugh, shake his head, pull his hood tighter against the cold. But sometimes, on quiet mornings, and he thought he heard it too. A faint vibration in the ground. A murmur under his feet. Like the planet dreaming. She called it the Earth's heart. Said there was one place left where it still beat. A valley untouched by the cold. A green valley hidden beyond the ridges protected by the mountains themselves. A place where trees still grew and rivers still sang. He thought it was a bedtime story. He didn't know it was a map. Every night she'd trace her fingers along an old leather-bound notebook. Lines marking symbols that meant nothing to him. "Someday," she'd whisper, "when the world forgets how to breathe, you'll need to find this place." He'd smile, nod, and drift to sleep to the sound of the wind brushing through the pines. Then came the light. It started as a shimmer, a bright band crawling across the sky. Scientists called it aurora inversion. News anchors smiled too wide, called it beautiful. The animals disagreed. They ran. Within days, the horizon grew heavy. Gray smoke rising from distant peaks and unending dusk swallowing noon. The first eruption hit the Pacific Ring, then another, then another. Volcanoes that had slept for millennia woke in the same hour. And in their roar, cities vanished. The air thickened. Ash fell like snow. By the third week, the sun was gone. Ethan remembered standing by the window, watching the sky fade to iron. His grandmother held his hand. Her skin trembled, but her voice didn't. "It's begun," she said softly. "The world's heart is breaking." They packed what they could. Jars, blankets, the leather-bound notebook. By the time they sealed the cabin, the air outside burned to breathe. The mountains disappeared behind a curtain of gray. He remembered the last night with her, the fire burning low, the hum beneath the floorboards fading like an old song. She pressed the notebook into his hands. "When everything turns to ash," she said, "remember. The earth keeps its promises. Find the valley. It remembers what we've forgotten." He wanted to ask her what it meant. He never got the chance. By morning, the silence was complete, and the boy who once believed the world would always make sense was the last one left to prove it. The sun had been gone for 9 years. No one remembered the color of light anymore. The sky was a thick iron ceiling, heavy and unmoving, pressing down until every breath felt stolen. What used to be blue had turned to ash, layers upon layers of gray dust falling endlessly from a sky that no longer cared. The snow that covered the mountains wasn't snow, it was bone dust, the memory of volcanoes breathing one last time. Some said the earth had gone silent. They were wrong. It still whispered, but only to those who remembered how to listen. A figure moved slowly through the gray, wrapped in torn canvas, his boots crunching into layers of frozen soot. His name was Ethan Cole. He didn't say it out loud anymore. There was no one left to hear it. He carried a pack, light and worn, strapped with rope and a small leather-bound book tied to its side, the only color in a world of monochrome. Every page inside was smudged, warped by moisture, ink running like tears. But the map was still there, his grandmother's hand still etched across the paper, a promise still waiting to be kept. Each morning he woke to the same sound. Wind, scraping across what used to be the lake. Each night he closed his eyes and saw flashes of before. Light spilling through a window, his grandmother's voice humming softly, the smell of coffee and pine. Then came the fire, the silence, the ash. In the first years after the collapse, there were voices on the radio. Now only static. Even echoes had grown tired. He survived because routine demanded it. Wake before dawn, though dawn no longer came. Melt snow, boil it, drink. Patch the walls, check the traps, count the cans. And every night before sleep, trace the map again with his finger. The mountains, the ridges, the symbol marked like a heartbeat. The green valley. He didn't know why he still believed in it. He had seen too much to trust in myths, and yet, it was the only thing that hadn't turned to dust. That morning, when the wind fell still, he knew something had changed. The silence felt different, not empty, but waiting. He stood outside his shelter, a collapsed observation tower half buried under ice, and stared across the frozen plain. For the first time in years, he could see the horizon. The storm had cleared. He opened the notebook carefully, like a priest handling scripture. The inked lines were faint now, but familiar. Each ridge was a memory, each symbol a whisper. And there, faint but visible, a marking shaped like a spiral, drawn beside the word ridge. He turned, scanning the distance. The mountains lay to the west, dark shadows half swallowed by fog. Somewhere beyond them, the earth was still breathing. He could almost hear his grandmother's voice. When the world forgets how to breathe, you must find the valley. He packed the last of his supplies, a flask of melted snow, 2 cans of dried beans, a hand-cranked flashlight. His fingers brushed the camera he hadn't used since the light vanished. The battery was dead, but he carried it anyway. A relic of color, proof that the world once reflected something more than gray. As he stepped out into the stillness, his boots sank into powder. Each step left a print, and the wind did not erase it. The air was colder than breath, sharper than glass. But beneath the frost, the earth hummed, faint, steady, patient. Hours passed like minutes. The line between day and night no longer existed, only shades of darkness broken by the pale glow of the horizon. At some point he stopped, not because he was tired, though he was always tired, but because the ground had changed. The crust beneath his feet was warmer. A faint mist coiled from the cracks between stones, carrying a smell that didn't belong, not sulfur, not ash. Something living. He knelt, brushing aside the dust. The soil beneath was darker, moist. He froze. Moisture meant heat. Heat meant life. He dug further, his gloved hands trembling. And there, caught between 2 stones, Wybrow, was a shard of something green. Not glass. Not mineral. A leaf. He stared at it for a long time, afraid to blink. Afraid it would vanish like everything else had. It was dry, almost petrified, veins etched like old scars. But it was green. In a world where even memory had turned to smoke, here lay proof. Proof of life. The hum beneath his feet grew stronger. He pressed his palm to the ground and closed his eyes. It was faint, like the echo of a heart once beating steady and slow. But it was there. He took the shard, wrapped it in a strip of cloth, and slipped it into his pocket. The map had been right. There was still something out there. Something the ash hadn't touched. The sky rumbled, distant but deep. He looked up, the clouds moving low, thick with ice. A storm was forming again. He pulled his scarf tighter, turned toward the west. The journey ahead was long, and most who had tried had never returned. But none of them had the map. None of them had seen the proof. He walked until the wind returned, sharp and endless, sweeping across the plain like breath over a wound. Each gust whispered the same question. Why keep walking? He didn't answer, because he didn't walk for himself anymore. He walked for a promise. By nightfall, though night was a matter of imagination, he found the edge of the ridge. A frozen river cut through the land like a scar, its surface black and glassy. Beyond it, the first rise of the mountains waited, jagged, skeletal, alive. He set camp beneath the remains of a dead tree, its bark flaking to powder. The fire sputtered, smoke curling weakly into air too thin to hold it. He ate in silence. There was no taste. From his pack, he pulled the notebook again. By flickering firelight, he traced the next line on the map. A curve, a symbol like an eye, a word, barely visible under the ink smudge, entry. The valley wasn't far now. He looked out toward the horizon, the place where the world once ended. For a moment, he imagined he could see light moving behind the mountains. Not fire, not storm. Something else. A shimmer, a promise. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole whispered a word he'd forgotten the meaning of. Tomorrow. The wind carried it away into the darkness. But the earth heard him, and somewhere beneath the ash it stirred. The morning didn't arrive so much as loosen its grip on the dark. The sky stayed the color of old metal, and the land lay flattened under a pelt of ash that moved like breath when the wind exhaled. Ethan broke camp without speaking, because there was no one to hear, and because words had become a luxury this world rarely afforded. He checked the leather-bound notebook with his thumb, feeling for the ridge of the ribbon he used as a marker, then tucked it under his coat close to his chest, where old promises were kept warm. The frozen river cut the plain like a black seam. He tested the ice with the heel of his boot, once, twice, listening for the language of cracks. It answered in faint hairline whispers, spidering out and stopping as if reconsidering him. He stepped lightly, each breath measured, and crossed to the opposite bank where the land rose a little, and the wind spoke in a higher register. From there the world opened, an endless field of gray dunes, a dead ocean stilled in mid-tide. Half-buried fence posts leaned at strange angles. A billboard, face eaten away, held up its naked bones to a sky that refused to look back. He kept to the shallow valleys between ash ridges, where the wind couldn't steal as much heat from his skin and where tracks, his and others, would be harder to read. The map sent him west by north, across what had once been ranches and open road, now a single continuous sheet of forgetting. Hours passed inside the slow cadence of footfall and breath. Footfall and breath, the body's metronome steadying a mind that preferred to wander back into color. When memory came, he let it pass over him like weather. The porch, the laugh, her hand over his on the notebook spine. Then it was only the land again. By midday, a storm began to gather at the edges of the plain. He felt it first in the pressure behind his eyes, a heaviness that made focus hard. The horizon thickened, blurred, and then the air filled with small, hard particles that moved, too fast to be snow and too soft to be sand, ash needles. He wrapped his scarf higher, pulled his goggles down, and dropped to a crouch beside a half-buried car whose roof and doors had surrendered to years of abrasion. The world narrowed to the immediate, the grit on his teeth, the hiss of ash against his coat, the exact flex of his calves as he stayed low to keep from being knocked over. He waited until the storm remembered to breathe out, then moved in those brief intervals, like a swimmer timing waves. An overpass rose out of the gray, its concrete ribs exposed where the earth had been gnawed away. The bridge deck had split and fallen at the center, laying a crude mouth over the empty highway below. He stood at the base and looked up through the grainy filter of his goggles. The rebar hung like vines, black and wet-looking. He could have detoured, but detours in this world cost more than they paid. He found the shallowest angle where ash had drifted into a slope and started to climb, hands finding purchase in cracks, boots kicking steps into the softened concrete. Halfway up, the wind shifted and the slope let go beneath him with a quiet sigh. He slid, caught an exposed beam with his forearm, bit down on a yell he couldn't afford, and hung there feeling the ache bloom, hot and then dull. He waited for the ground to stop moving under him, then pulled himself higher, inch by inch, refusing to look down, until his fingers hooked over the bridge lip, and he could lever himself onto the deck. The highway was a ribbon lost to its own unraveling. He moved along it anyway, because height bought him distance and distance bought him time. There was an exit sign ahead, its green mostly devoured, the white lettering ghosting through, Aurora, too. He remembered a city that had sounded like that. He remembered it lit up at night like a constellation that had fallen to the ground and decided to live there. He imagined the same place now, hollowed and humming with wind, and kept walking. A husk of a service station crouched at the foot of the off-ramp, its canopy bent, pumps drowned in drifts. He ducked inside the glassless doorway and found the echo of a life. A coffee cup turned upside down, A rack still holding a few mummified candy bars. A clock stopped at nothing. In the back, behind the counter, a door stuck under the weight of years gave after he leaned into it. The storage room smelled faintly of fuel and damp cardboard. On a shelf under a collapsed box of paper towels, he found a plastic-wrapped emergency radio. He turned the crank. The handle protested, a small bone grinding in its socket, and then the speaker coughed static into the room. He adjusted the dial with the patience of someone who'd learned that answers arrive slowly, if they arrive at all. Static, static, a high, thin whistle. Then words. Not words exactly. The suggestion of them. A pattern that fought through the noise with the stubbornness of something that once mattered. Sinit, repeat. In zone. Coordinates. Evacu. He froze, lost the line, found it again like a fish biting, letting go, biting. Assignated green zone. Agricultural preserve. Microclimate retention. Classified access. Underground ridge entry. The voice was genderless, flattened by time and by the signal's long journey through broken air. It stuttered, looped, and then fell back into static as if ashamed of its hope. He cranked harder, coaxed a few more syllables out of it, enough to know the message wasn't live. A recording. An old emergency broadcast bouncing between dead towers, refusing to admit that the audience had left. Green zone, he set the radio down and leaned both hands on the counter until the trembling in his forearm steadied. The words didn't prove anything. But paired with the spiral on the page, the word entry scratched into the margin, the leaf asleep in his pocket, it became weight. It pulled him forward. He shouldered his pack again and stepped back into the whistle of the plane. The storm had torn itself out by then, leaving a quieter fall, the world sifting itself into new shapes. He followed the off-ramp into what had been a town. Low buildings, the carcass of a grocery store with its roof in the aisle, a school with murals still clinging to its inside, walls where the outside had peeled away. He moved quietly past them all. Because emptiness had a way of not being empty when you believed in it too much. At the far end of town, a field opened where the snow-drifted ash lay smooth as a sheet. He crossed it, the crunch of his boots the only punctuation, until a speck darkened the whiteness ahead, a shape no bigger than his hand. It didn't belong. The plane had no interest in singularities. He quickened his pace, felt the caution of a hunter tighten his shoulders, and slowed again as he came within reach. A bird lay on its side. One wing flared at an angle that meant pain. Not a scavenger's leftover. There were no tracks around it. A hawk, feathers dull but intact, its chest rising and falling in shallow, economical breaths. Its eye opened when his shadow crossed it, yellow, fierce, unbroken by fear. The wing had been torn by wind or bad luck, he couldn't tell. He crouched beside it and held his hands out, palms open as if he were approaching a ledge. I don't know how to mend anything that flies, he said to a world that didn't require replies. The bird blinked. He took off his glove, hissing when the air bit his skin, and used the warm hand to check the brake. Not shattered. Out of socket, maybe. Dislocated. He thought of the boy. He'd been when there were clinics, and texts and people, to tell him where to put his hands. He thought of his grandmother fixing small things with larger patience. He breathed out slowly and did what he could remember. Set the bone with pressure, not force. Coax the joint back into the memory of where it belonged. The hawk shuddered once, a ripple through muscle and tendon, then lay still, breaths evening. He bound the wing against its body with a strip of cloth, torn from the hem of his shirt, and cupped, the bird in both hands, a sharp-hearted bundle of heat against the cold. It weighed almost nothing. He set it inside his coat, where the heart once again had work to do, and felt the animal settle against his sternum like a living compass. He stood and moved on. The map nudged him toward a low chain of hills that had been mountains in a softer age. He skirted their base, choosing the side where the drift was thinner, and climbed a shallow saddle where the wind scoured the rock clean. From that height he could see a city, or what had been one, sprawled in the basin. Beyond, blocks set at right angles, a river frozen mid-gesture, towers that had become stumps in a field of concrete wheat. The ash had filled the streets to their window sills, making new avenues along rooftops and sky bridges. He considered the detour and dismissed it. Cities held two things now, shelter and trouble, and they were the same thing seen from different distances. Still, he needed cover. The next storm was gathering, the air's pressure changing its mind again. He descended into the edge of the city where the buildings were low and thick-walled, warehouses, distribution centers, places built to hold and be held. He found a loading dock whose overhang still kept a square of ground comparatively clean, forced the door with a pry bar he carried for exactly these conversations, and slipped into the stale darkness. The echo inside was generous. He stood still until the space told him its size. The hawk shifted against his chest. He unzipped his coat, just enough for air to move, and set the bird in a crate lined with an old plastic tarp. It watched him as if he were a peculiar weather pattern. He scavenged with hands that knew how to listen. A stack of pallets for fuel, a nest of old shipping blankets for warmth, a pallet wrap that would hold heat if he hung it as a curtain. He made a small fire in a metal bin and let the smoke find its own exits through cracks and seams. The light didn't travel far, but it didn't need to. He ate slowly, ritual more than hunger, and then he opened the notebook again. The spiral near the word ridge matched the contour lines on the page he'd been ignoring. A canyon carved like a fingerprint, turning inward, then opening into a bowl. He traced the path with his finger, feeling the way the lines tightened and relaxed. At the base of the spiral, a tiny symbol, not a tree exactly, but something that suggested one. He closed his eyes and held the paper to his nose, as if old ink might give off a scent. The hawk ruffled its bound wing, the sound a soft sibilant like the turning of a page. Footsteps. He heard them because he was listening for nothing. Nothing is loud when you train for it. He covered the fire with a metal sheet to flatten, raised light and moved toward the shadow of a forklift. Molded out of dust, the footsteps were wrong in rhythm, too light for a man, too organized for animals. He waited until the sound threaded itself into the room and took shape. A figure ghosted through the doorway, bent low, wrapped in layers stitched from scavenged textiles, a coat pieced from emergency blankets, a hood woven from pack straps, goggles smeared against glare. They moved like someone used to moving in silence. They paused when the heat met their face, stood listening with their head cocked, in a way that said childhood had taught them to count exits, and then stepped inside, closing the door against the world's mouth. They lifted their goggles. A woman, younger than the world, older than she should have been. Her eyes weighed him fast, then flicked to the crate where the hawk watched, then back again. She didn't speak yet, which he counted as wisdom. "I won't take your fire," she said finally, voice scraped by cold and distance. "I only want to sit near it until my hands remember being hands." He nodded and moved a little to the side so the circle widened. The hawk blinked. The woman crouched near the warmth. Palms floated over it like pilgrims over relics, then flattened against her knees. She closed her eyes and let the heat talk to the bones. When she opened them, she looked at the notebook on his thigh and then away quickly, the way one looks at a grief that doesn't belong to them. "You're headed west," she said. He didn't answer. She took his silence for confirmation. "Don't cross the river at the broken spire," she added. "The ice looks honest there, but it lies. Go 2 bridges north. There's a current under the skin." "Thank you," he said, and realized he hadn't used the word in months. It sounded cautious leaving him, surprised at its own survival. She glanced at the hawk again. "Why carry weight that won't carry you?" He touched the crate gently. The hawk's eye tracked his hand as if its life were attached to it by invisible thread. "Because it was falling," he said. She considered that, nodded once. "There are worse reasons." The room settled into the kind of quiet that was actually full of sound. The soft lick of flame, the whisper of ash outside, the small rearrangements of an animal deciding how to sleep. After a while, the woman spoke again, words falling as if they belonged to someone else and she'd simply borrowed them for the night. "There's talk," she said, "old talk from before I was born, about a place that stayed green when the sky went out. Government talk. Not on the radios are for people. The wires under the ground. They called it an agricultural preserve, a microclimate experiment. They called it something you could measure and break apart with money. But the ones who went looking for it didn't carry rulers. They carried prayer." He waited because rushing this kind of talk was like shouting at a sleeping animal. "My father said once," she continued, "that the earth remembers the shape of breath. If you build a valley the right way, walls high, mouth narrow, water deep, it can hold a season the way cupped hands hold water. He drew it for me in the dust, a spiral that opens at the end like an eye waking up. He looked down at the notebook, at the spiral his grandmother's hand had made before the world decided to test her faith. "If you find it," the woman said, "don't tell anyone where it is." "I don't intend to tell anyone anything," he said. "That's what everyone says." Her mouth tried to be a smile and failed. And then they remember how sweet it is to be believed. She stood as if the decision to leave had been made before. She arrived and she had only kept it, waiting out of politeness. "2 bridges north," she said again. "The second one sings if you put your ear to it. That's how you'll know." He wanted to ask her name, then thought about the way names tethered people to other people, to promises and losses. "I'll listen," he said. She pulled the hood forward, goggles down. "Do that," she replied and slipped out the door, taking only her shadow with her. The wind sighed as it met her back and welcomed her into its movement. He stood for a moment with his hand on the latch, feeling the temperature change across his knuckles, then barred the door and returned to the knot fire, to the hawk, to the map that had grown heavier by a woman's story. He slept in fragments and woke into a morning that was simply a different shape of dark. He fed the small blaze, checked the hawk's wing. The swelling had receded. The joint stayed where it should and ate in slow, respectful bites. He fashioned a sling from the remainder of his shirt and secured the bird to his pack, where its warmth would be a kind of company and its eyes a warning. Then he stepped out into the city's echo and followed the vein of the frozen river. 2 bridges north. The first lay bent in the middle, a bowed back that had given up. He crossed where the drift had made a ramp and held his breath the entire length of it, as if oxygen might weigh him down. The second stood cleaner, as if the wind had decided it liked the angle of its lines and kept them brushed. He set his ear to the rail, lips pressed flat to keep the cold from taking them, and listened. At first, only the small household sounds of a dying world. The buzz of frost, the tap of ash against metal. Then in the deep seam between steel and ice, a tone. Not loud, not constant, but intermittent and true. The river moved under its own prison, slow and insistent. He smiled without meaning to, the expression strange on a face that had become economy, and crossed where the current told him the ice was thickest. West of the city, the land remembered. It had been a prairie once and flattened itself in apology. He walked through it under a sky that had started to bruise at the edges. The hawk shifted when he stumbled and stilled when he steadied, an agreement of bodies. He reached the first bulge of the foothills, by the time the wind grew teeth again, and set his shelter behind a boulder that had scaled itself with lichen the color of old money. When the small fire took, he warmed a palm-sized stone and slid it into the sling beside the hawk, watching the animal settle on the borrowed hearth. He opened the notebook one more time and held it at an angle to the flame until a faint, previously invisible line appeared, ink that had been heat-reactive. A trick of a mind that knew paper doesn't always survive, but sometimes it does. The line threaded the spiral and marked a notch on its outer rim, no larger than a fingernail. Beside it, pressed into the page so lightly it was more feeling than sight, a word: resonance. He looked up at the black comb of the ridgeline against the sky. Valleys that could hold a season, bridges that sang, rivers that moved under ice. A hawk's heart against a human one, keeping time. He slept and woke and walked. The days were not days, but they moved anyway because time is stubborn. The land tilted more, pulling him into the ribs of the mountains. Trees appeared here and there, charred spears at first, then trunks that had held their shape without their skin, then, impossibly, a copse of firs whose needles had browned but not fallen, their geometry unwilling to admit defeat. He ran his fingers along a branch, and came away with a scent so faint he thought he might have invented it: resin, ghost of green. There were signs of others, a pair of prints that had been pressed deep enough to survive a gust, a shelter dug into the windward side of a hill, and abandoned in careful order, the husk of a camp where someone had burned books not out of malice but out of winter. He kept his distance from such histories, nodding to them like tombstones, and climbed. At the mouth of a narrow canyon, the wind paused as if considering whether to go in. The walls rose on either side in a clean, deliberate curve, stone striations stacked like the pages of a book thick with marginalia. He stood under the arch of it and felt something gather in his chest, not fear, not hope exactly, but attention sharpened to a point so fine it could pierce anything. He stepped forward and the world changed its acoustics. Sound became round, His boots scuffed and the echo returned immediate and warm, as if the canyon liked the way he moved. He took 3 more steps and stopped. There, a third of the way up the right-hand wall, a symbol had been chiseled into the stone and then smoothed by many hands. A spiral, tight at the center, opening outward like breath. He set his palm against it and felt a low vibration rise from the rock into the skin, up through bone into the small bones of the ear resonance. He closed his eyes and let the sound tell him what the map could not, that he was standing at the threshold of something the world had tried and failed to bury. He entered the canyon. The air grew slightly warmer, 2 degrees, maybe 3, but enough for the lungs to loosen, enough for the hawk to lift its head and test the air with its beak. The floor tilted down and then leveled, the curve tightening, then releasing, the geometry of a body designed to protect a heart. He took the turns with care, counting paces, noting how the light softened as the walls lifted and the sky above ribboned into a narrow strip. The canyon opened abruptly, not with the grandiosity of revelation, but with the certainty of a door swinging on a well-oiled hinge. He stepped out onto a ledge and the world below him breathed. He didn't say the word green because saying it would have been smaller than seeing it. The floor of the hidden basin lay cupped in stone hands, a mosaic of reeds and low brush. Dark water pooled where the land's pulse rose to the surface, a stand of firs near the far slope, their needles dull but present, stubborn constellations of lichen bright against rock, steam lifted from places where the earth's heat exhaled. A small wind moved there, a different wind, one that carried undecayed smells, wet bark, mineral, something that might be the very old memory of grass. Above, the ash sky thinned from iron to pewter, light, not sunlight, not truly, but something kin to it, made a geometry of shadow that felt like prayer. He knelt without deciding to and pressed his palm to the rock. The vibration was stronger here, a lullaby too slow for anything but bone to hear. The hawk stirred, and he unfastened the sling so the bird could shift onto the ledge beside him. It hopped once, twice, then stood listing a little, head high, eyes wide. It made a sound, a low, rasping whistle, that answered the basin's quiet like a note in a chord. He closed the notebook. He didn't need it for this. He watched the basin for a long time, looking for movement that wasn't wind. There, by the water, ripples that began without a visible beginning. A frog, a fish. He didn't know which hope his mind had smuggled in and which belonged. At the far edge of the basin, where the slope folded back on itself, something human had once worked. Stone set in a pattern not made by freeze and thaw. A low wall broken in 2 places. A gate fallen inward. The suggestion of terracing cut into earth, now soft with years. He saw the logic of it. Hold water here, release it there. Let the warm breath from beneath feed it when the sky refused. Someone had known. Not only known but tried. He felt a complicated gratitude for hands he would never shake. The hawk lifted its bound wing, tested, and let it rest again. He breathed with the valley. The sound he made matched the resonance, and for a fragile moment the world inside him aligned with the one outside. Then he saw the smoke. Not smoke exactly, not the dirty kind the old world made, but a thin column of vapor rising where it should not. Too steady to be water, too precise to be weather. He followed it with his eyes, to a point along the basin's curve where the wall had been reinforced long ago, with fitted stones. There, tucked into shadow, an opening had been cut, half collapsed. More suggestion than passage, and from it rose the quiet breath. He stood, all his aches suddenly articulate again, and adjusted the weight of his pack. The hawk hopped to his shoulder, claws careful in their choice of purchase. He laughed once, soft, small, and it startled him. A sound misplaced and then found. He took the ledge path down, testing each patch of scree before asking it to hold him, circling toward the opening that exhaled. At the threshold he paused. The air from within was warmer by several degrees and carried a smell he hadn't tasted in the open. World in years, soil alive, not merely present, earth that had kept a promise. He ducked inside, moving sideways to spare his shoulder and the hawk on it, and entered a corridor hardly higher than his head. The stones had been cut and placed, not elegantly but with conviction, and sealed with a mortar now flaking to powder. He took 3 steps, then 4, and reached a chamber the size of a small room. There, a pump sat like a heart that had remembered its function. Old, manual, valves seized, but the pipe that fed it still vibrated gently with the insistence of water. On the floor beside it, a metal placard had come loose from its bolts and lay, face up under a dust of ages. He wiped it with his sleeve until letters emerged, black and patient. USDA, Microclimate Retention Pilot. Project Green Vein, Basin 3. Access authorized personnel only. He let the words live in him the way he'd let the resonance do, not as explanation but as proof that someone had stood here before and believed. In the same shape of salvation. He set his hand on the pump lever. It didn't move. He set both hands and felt for the thing under the thing. The angle, the mood, and leaned into it. The lever gave with a sound like a rusted throat clearing. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th pull, water answered. It came cold and iron sweet, thin at first, then gathering itself into a thin rope that fell into the basin's stone bowl. He cupped his hands under it and lifted them to his mouth, and the water entered like a memory returning, like color finding its way back to a map someone had erased in anger. He drank until his stomach remembered the meaning of enough and then dipped his fingers into the flow and let them lift to the hawk's beak. The bird took the drops delicately and made that rasping whistle again, softer now, a syllable of relief. Outside, the basin breathed. Inside, the pump clicked as its valves negotiated a truce with time. He looked around the chamber, saw metal cabinets with their doors sprung and empty, a rack where tools had once hung, the ghost shapes of shovels and picks traced in lighter dust. On the wall, chalk lines had been drawn, measurements, dates, notes. He held the light to them and found, beneath the last legible entry, a handprint in green, a child's maybe, or an adult who couldn't keep the color off their skin. He lifted his own hand and didn't set it there. It felt like signing a book that wasn't his. He went back out into the valley, stopping at the threshold to let his eyes relearn distance. The wind in this basin had its own dictionary. It spoke in the SS of reeds, in the soft lap of water against stone, in a rattle he realized was seed pods holding onto their cargo with both hands. He let his breath match it again. He thought of the woman in the warehouse telling him not to tell, and of the part of him that had missed being believed. He would sleep here tonight. Not in the chamber, that felt wrong. A place for work, not rest, but under the ledge where the rock overhung a patch of ground that felt chosen for lying down and looking up. He gathered deadfall from the stand of fir, the limbs that had fallen naturally, the way one takes from a table where the host has already set out what guests may have and built a fire, scarcely larger than his 2 hands pressed together. Its light was a small coin in the basin's dusk, buying him a circle of warmth and a place for his eyes to rest. He ate, fed the hawk, drank water that tasted like the inside of a mountain, and unfolded the notebook. He held it over the flame until the heat coaxed the hidden inks out of hiding. Lines bloomed. Symbols clarified. The spiral matched the basin so closely it felt as if the map had been drawn from this very ledge and only then folded and carried back through time for him. At the bottom of the page, where a corner had curled from years of being turned with care, he saw writing he hadn't noticed. A sentence in his grandmother's hand. Small and sure, if you found this, the world kept its promise. Keep yours. He closed the book and pressed it against his sternum and felt the hawk shift. The heat of the small body translated through leather and paper into human chest. He lay back on the ground and let his spine memorize the basin's curve. Above, the sky thinned further, and for a moment that could have been invention. Or mercy. The ash veil parted enough to suggest a lighter seam beyond it. Not stars, not yet, but a hint that the idea of them had not died. He slept, and the dreams were not of fire. They were of water moving under ice, of stones singing, of a leaf so green it hurt to look at and then did not hurt at all. When he woke, it was to the sound of the hawk shifting into the blue hour, testing its bound wing against the new day's shape. The world outside the basin would continue to howl. It didn't matter. Something here had remembered, and now so had he. Tomorrow he would explore the terraces and see if the earth would accept seed. Tomorrow he would trace the pipes and find where the warmth came from. Tomorrow, he might even set his hand on the pump handle and teach it to move easily again. For now he lay still, letting the valley's breath rise and fall under the same rhythm as his own, and thought not with yearning, not with fear, but with a clarity that felt like light of how he would leave without erasing his footprints, and of who, if anyone, he might someday bring back to follow them. The wind that lived in the valley was different. It moved slow, as if it remembered gentler times. Every breath that left the earth returned soft, full, forgiving. Ethan woke to the hush of it, not silence, but balance. The kind of quiet that meant the world was thinking again. He sat up slowly, his body stiff from the cold, his mind heavy with something new, not fear, not grief. Purpose. The hawk stirred beside him, feathers ruffling and the faint warmth rising from the ground. It tested its bound wing, stretched, then folded it close. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, but the air still carried a hint of life, the faint, damp scent of soil that remembered rain. He looked out over the basin. Morning had come differently here, light crawling not from the horizon but from below, reflected off the steam that curled from the vents in the rock. Water shimmered at the center, rippling with movement that could not be wind alone. Life. He took a slow breath. It tasted unfamiliar, heavy, clean, real. He stood brushing dust from his coat and descended the narrow path into the heart of the valley. Every step echoed with warmth rising through his boots. The stones here were not cold, they pulsed faintly, a heartbeat buried deep beneath miles of ash. He knelt beside a patch of moss clinging to the edge of a boulder. It wasn't green like memory. It was darker, thicker, almost black. But when he touched it, it gave slightly under his fingers, alive. His grandmother's words echoed, carried by wind and memory. When the world forgets how to breathe, the earth will hide its breath and wait. She had been right. The earth hadn't died. It had retreated. And now, standing in the only place still breathing, he felt small, smaller than he had ever been, yet finally, right-sized. He followed the water's edge until he reached the far side of the basin where the old stonework rose like broken ribs. The collapsed gate and crumbled terraces spoke of hands long gone. He traced the grooves of a carved spiral on one slab, the same symbol from his grandmother's map. This was no accident. Someone had built this. Someone had believed. He knelt, brushing dirt from a half-buried crate. The markings had faded, but faint letters emerged under his hand. Agricultural substrate, Lot 12B. Inside, vacuum-sealed packets, cracked but intact. He pulled one free. The label still legible. Heirloom Seed Bank, Phase 3. Seeds. Carried through apocalypse. Buried here to wait. He opened the packet gently. Inside, small black dots, each one a memory of life. He looked at the soil around his boots and damp, rich, humming faintly. He dug with his hands, set a few seeds in place, covered them with care. Not as a farmer, not as a savior, just as a promise. He fetched water from the pump chamber, now flowing clear and steady. The first few drops fell awkwardly, splashing more ash than soil. The next landed true. He watched the earth drink, watched the surface darken. The hawk hopped closer, head tilting, eyes fixed on the small patch of turned ground. "Give it time," Ethan whispered. "Everything good needs time." He worked through the morning, opening more crates, stacking what remained, clearing the terraces so the sun, what little filtered light the ash sky offered, could reach the valley floor. When his hands were raw and the last of his water gone, he sat back and stared at the small stretch of ground now marked with life's memory. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He reached for the notebook, the one thing that had carried him here. Its edges were torn, its spine cracked. He flipped to the last page, blank, waiting. He took a piece of charcoal from the fire's remains and began to write. The valley is real. The world still breathes here. If you find this place, listen. He paused, looking up at the basin's curve, at the steam lifting skyward like prayer. Do not build walls around it. Do not take more than you need. The earth remembers. He closed the book and placed it near the pump, weighing it down with a stone, an offering to whoever might come after. By afternoon, the air began to shift. The warmth that had filled the basin now trembled. Disrupted by a cold pulse rolling in from the east, clouds thickened, heavy and black. A storm. Not just another ash squall. This was something older, stronger. The sky rumbled deep, a sound that vibrated the canyon walls. He looked to the hawk. It stood on the rock's edge, feathers rippling, gaze fixed on the dark horizon. The storm would bury this place again, unless he could protect it. He sprinted to the pump chamber, his breath loud in the enclosed space. The water pipes shook faintly, connected to vents higher up the ridge. If he could redirect the pressure, seal the mouth of the canyon before the storm hit, The valley might survive. He searched the walls, eyes darting over faded dials and rusted wheels until one caught his hand. A valve marked Drain Redirect East. He gripped it, twisted. The wheel groaned, reluctant, then gave. A rumble shook the ground as hidden gates began to shift, stone grinding against stone. Outside, the wind hit, a low scream that rolled through the canyon, flattening what little brush had grown. Dust lifted, spiraling, stinging his skin. He staggered toward the ledge, pulling his scarf tight, eyes barely open. The storm poured over the mountains like a black ocean. He felt it before he saw it, a wave of heat, ash, and pressure crashing through the air. He dropped low, covering his head. The hawk leapt skyward and against all reason, against all weight, its wings catching the violent air, riding it. It vanished into the storm, a single moving shape swallowed by chaos. He crawled to the nearest ridge, gripping stone slick with ash, and watched as the redirected vents along the canyon walls released thick steam, walls of heat colliding with the incoming cold. The air screamed. Then at silence, the wave split. The storm curved, wrapping around the basin, its heart diverted, sliding along the mountain's edge. The valley held. When it was over, the world fell quiet again. Not the emptiness of death, but the pause between heartbeats. Ash drifted down in thin strands, landing soft. He stood coughing, face streaked black and gray. His eyes burned, but his chest was full. The valley still breathed. He stumbled to the pump, turned it once more as water flowed, steady, strong. He looked out at the small patch where he'd planted the seeds. The soil was darker now, moist, waiting. He sank to his knees, head bowed, the weight of exhaustion pressing him down. In that silence, he felt something move beside him. A shadow, small and soft. He lifted his eyes. The hawk had returned, feathers streaked with soot but alive. It landed beside the patch of soil, lowered its head, and drank from a puddle forming at the base of the rock. Ethan smiled, the expression trembling at first, then holding. The fire inside him, the one that had been dying since the day the sky went dark, finally warmed again. He whispered, almost to the earth itself, "It's not over." The wind answered, carrying with it the faintest sound, not storm, not stone. A whisper, like leaves. He leaned closer. There, beneath the thin crust of wet soil, the smallest flicker of green. A sprout. He laughed, quietly, disbelievingly, a sound that cracked the still air. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In a world that had forgotten color, one breath of life was enough to remind it how to start again. He stood looking out over the valley, steam curling, ash falling, water flowing, and that single trembling green. The sky above remained heavy gray, unbroken. But somewhere beyond it he felt light. He reached down, brushed the seedling gently and whispered, "Keep breathing." The world did. Hope you enjoy. Do like, share, and subscribe.